Hey everybody! Today we're at the third part of our series on the effects of human appropriation of ecosystems, goods, and services. And today we're going to look at invasive species and nutrient loading in terrestrial ecosystems. Next time we'll look at nutrient loading in aquatic ecosystems. So let's get started. The world can be divided into 6 to 8 biogeographic regions. And what that means is these have distinctive flora and fauna, and they have a distinctive flora and fauna because the evolution of that region has been relatively isolated for a long period of time, way back in evolutionary history. So in that time, that region has developed a distinctive flora and fauna. Any species not native to an area is considered exotic. We also have several terms for exotic species. They could be called non-native, they can be called introduced, they can be called foreign, they can be called alien, but they all mean the same thing. The species under consideration is not native to the local area. This is a good topic to follow agriculture because most crop plants grown around the world are not native to the region in which they are cultivated. And this is also true of the weeds that are in most crop fields around the world. They've all traveled around. In North America, most of our commonest weed species are not native. They are exotic. The big question about exotic species is whether they are generally a problem in their new ecosystem, or if most of the time they are good citizens. And by that we mean, do they cause problems for the ecosystem that they join, or do they just fit in? What do you think the answer to that is? So those that cause problems are called invasive species. And the problems were originally thought of as ecological, but now we also consider them economic. So a lot of things which cause economic problems are also considered invasive species, whether or not they cause an ecological problem. The possible problems caused by an exotic species fall into two rough categories. One is they could cause the extinction of the native species. Two, they could change the ecosystem structure in a way that decreases productivity, that decreases stability, or that changes the structure over time so that native species are adversely affected. In general, a species affects its ecosystem by its niche overlap with other species, in other words, by competition, and by interactions with other species as a predator, a parasite, or a disease. So, in theory, we would expect that some exotic species will have a niche that is unoccupied in the new habitat, or at least has a lot of room, and therefore this new species would just fit in. For example, they could be a parasite controlled by density-independent mortality factors, and therefore not really compete with anything, not really ever reach a population level that harms, let's say, a plant that they're a parasite on, and therefore they would just fit in without really causing much problem. On the other hand, the introduction of a new species could also set off a trophic cascade. It could decimate one of the keystone species, and we're going to talk about that concept of a keystone species, and therefore change the structure. So how often do exotic species cause problem? Well, so in one study that I looked at, there was an estimate there are about 50,000 exotic species of plants and animals in the United States. And of these, about 4,300 have been considered invasive. That's about 8.6%. So it's really not the lion's share of exotic species that are causing the problem. If we want to look at what are the general conclusions we can make about invasive species, the first thing we'll say is that in general, a relatively small number, under 10% of exotic species, are expected to become invasive. I've heard some ecologists claim that multicellular exotic organisms have never caused an extinction in a continental ecosystem and thus are not a major threat in a continental context. So by that I mean a species that has been introduced to North America. However, it can be shown that exotic organisms have drastically decreased the population of native species, and the significance of that is that population size is inversely related to the probability of extinction. Large population, less chance of extinction. Small population, larger chance of extinction. There may also be a time frame issue. Human beings have only realized the problem with an invasive species in the last 30 years or so, and so perhaps not enough time has passed to see extinctions. So, for example, there may be a reduction in biodiversity over long periods of time. And it has been shown that non-native plants of all types harbor smaller numbers of insect species, and this could have a trophic cascade at higher trophic levels that depend on the insects for their nutrition. And it may also make certain native insect species vulnerable to extinction as well. What else can we say about invasive species? Well, the first thing is that exotic diseases are generally very destructive. We have the case of the chestnut blight, which is a fungus that affects chestnut trees. 200 years ago, the dominant tree in eastern deciduous forests were chestnuts. They are gone now. They still survive as rootstocks, which resprout on a regular basis, but then they get the blight and die off again. But other than that, there are no chestnuts actually producing seed. There are no majestic chestnuts left in our eastern forests. Exotic species that are introduced to islands often cause extinctions, and this includes Australia, which is a continent-sized island. So exotic species can have an effect on islands. Invasive species are well known to reduce populations. For example, in many states, more than 80% of the eastern hemlock, a tree, are gone due to the release of the exotic hemlock woolly adelgid insect, which has now become an invasive species. In addition, generalist species can have large effects on ecosystems, even if there are no immediate extinctions. The exotic zebra mussel, which has invaded the Great Lakes, has removed huge amounts of algae, solving a pollution problem, but it's also driven many, many native species to the edge of extinction. Time will tell whether they actually do go extinct. Invasive species can also alter the ecosystems in unexpected ways. The brown tree snake in Guam has led to a huge increase in the population of spiders. Now, Guam is an island, true, but still, it's had a trophic cascade where the population of spiders is now huge compared to what it once was. One piece of good news is that many, and perhaps most, exotic species that develop large populations and therefore are classified as invasive upon arrival, over time either get extirpated or reduced to smaller, non-harmful population size and therefore sort of fit in as good citizens. It is thought that this occurs because native species learn or evolve the ability to use or exploit the exotic species as a resource. So those are the major points about exotic species, and I'll leave you to do further research at some point and figure out what your take is on exotic species. Certainly not all exotic species are invasive, but invasive species do seem to cause a lot of problems. Let's move on to our second topic, which is the relationship between productivity, stability, and biodiversity. Productivity is just what it sounds like. It's measured by net primary productivity. The more productive an ecosystem is, the more human beings can harvest from it on a sustainable basis. And so productivity is important in many ways for us. Stability in ecosystems means low variance in net primary productivity, as well as low rates of change in species composition, which we can refer to in shorthand as biodiversity over time. From a human point of view, stability is good because it allows for accurate predictions to be made, and therefore our interaction with ecosystems is more understandable and manageable. Finally, biodiversity is a complex idea because it has two components. One component is just the number of species in an ecosystem, and the second component is how common each species is in an ecosystem. We have this feeling that an ecosystem with 10 species that are equally common is more biodiverse than an ecosystem with 10 species, of which there are 91 of species 1, and then a single individual of the other 9 species. So there are two components to biodiversity, number of species and how evenly they're distributed. We may explore this idea further later on in the course. For now, we're going to define biodiversity as the number of species in an ecosystem, And that is known as species richness. So we're going to take species richness as an indicator of biodiversity. That's the definition of those three terms. So let's go on and explore them in a little more detail. Biodiversity increases both productivity and stability, it turns out, and largely for the same reasons. The reason being compensation. The more biodiversity there is in an ecosystem, the more likely there is that there is significant niche overlap in species. For example, a species might have a large fundamental niche, meaning all the conditions under which it can survive and reproduce, and a much smaller realized niche, meaning the conditions under which it actually survives in a particular ecosystem, so that when it has competitors, it's reduced to a small niche, but if those competitors were to go away, it would expand its niche. And therefore, if the population of one of the competitors decreases, then its population may increase as a result. And this has the effect of compensation in the trophic structure of an ecosystem. And the ecosystem continues to function very well. And thus, productivity may not be affected, and the system will remain stable over time. And you won't get an extinction, but you'll just get variation in populations of organisms that have overlap in their fundamental niches. It's well known, for example, that climatic stability increases biodiversity, and this explains why tropical rainforests have more species than a temperate forest where there's a summer and winter. In tropical rainforests, species can more finely partition their niche space. And finer niche partitioning means there are more species available to compensate for each other. So if one's population gets reduced in a particular year, well, other species can compensate for it. So that's the connection between biodiversity and productivity and stability. Next, let's look at the effect of adding nutrients to terrestrial ecosystems. In most ecosystems, net primary productivity is limited by the amount of nitrogen available to plants, and secondarily by the amount of phosphorus available to plants. How do we show that? Well, we simply do an experiment where we add nitrogen to a plot and we see if total productivity goes up. And indeed, in most ecosystems, if you add nitrogen fertilizer or phosphorus fertilizer, the productivity of the ecosystem increases. We have already established that humans have increased the amount of nitrogen in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems largely through the process of industrial nitrogen fixation, which is also known as the Haber-Bosch process. So we know that all terrestrial ecosystems have a lot more nitrogen cycling through them now than they did, let's say, 150 years ago. You might think that an increase in nitrogen availability would increase the productivity of an ecosystem, and therefore that would be a good thing, especially from a human point of view. But here is the problem. The most recent research shows that while the major effect of nitrogen addition to the terrestrial ecosystem in short term is increased productivity, in the long term it causes significant reduction in biodiversity. And we already know what a reduction in biodiversity is going to do. The loss of biodiversity leads to long-term loss of productivity, plus a decrease in stability of the system. This is a good example of an unforeseen consequence that occurs as a result of a systemic response operating over time. And you may be wondering why adding nitrogen would decrease biodiversity. So the answer is, can you think of it? The answer is that the increase in nitrogen actually favors some competitors over others, and therefore leads to local extirpation of species, which means a decrease in biodiversity. And that seems to be what's going on. The last thing I want to talk about today is that some species disproportionately shape their ecosystems, and they're therefore known as keystone species. And if you don't remember what a keystone is the stone in a stone arch that if you remove it, the entire arch will fall down. And so the idea of a keystone species is a species that if it is removed from an ecosystem, it will cause the ecosystem to change drastically. It is the glue that holds the ecosystem together. We've already seen this with the wolves in Yellowstone Park. When they were removed, the plants were affected. So keystone species is another way to think about trophic cascades. If the removal of a species causes a trophic cascade, then it's probably a keystone species. And I might even take the probability out of there. I just put that in there to be cautious. So there are several kinds of keystone species. There are architect species. And architects are plants that create a disproportionate amount of niche space for other species. The saguaro cactus in the Sonoran Desert, that famous cactus that looks like this, creates out of this desert this three-dimensional landscape. And because it stores so much water during the rainy season, it creates all this niche space for other organisms that would not be able to survive in that desert without the cactus. Similarly, the kelp that grows in the rocky zone just offshore in the Pacific Ocean creates an entire vertical plantscape in the water that wouldn't be there without it, and therefore creates a whole fish community that can live in there. And not just fish, other aquatic organisms, especially aquatic invertebrates. The second type are called ecosystem engineers, and these are species that actually modify or create or maintain habitat and landscape around them. Some examples are beavers, alligators, American bison, elephants. They change the distribution and abundance of primary producers. They can cause the retention of water and create wetlands. They do all these things that modify the landscape and therefore change the ecosystem and foster biodiversity, productivity, and stability. There are keystone predators like the wolves in Yellowstone. And keystone predators maintain or increase biodiversity in trophic levels below their prey, and sometimes even in the level of their prey. There are also keystone prey, which I don't know much about, but these are resilient prey species that provide a stable food source that allows many other species in the ecosystem to survive, and if it goes, the ecosystem will collapse. And there are also keystone mutualists, and they're often pollinators and plants that depend on each other, and then those plants are probably architect species, and they create a habitat that is important. If one of those mutuals goes away, the ecosystem will change radically. So the loss or decrease in population of keystone species will undoubtedly alter the ecosystem. What that means is that when nitrogen or phosphorus is added and biodiversity decreases, when invasive species come in and change the population size of native species, we are being set up for trophic cascades that are going to fundamentally change ecosystems, and at least in the short term and even in the near term of several thousand years, are going to decrease productivity and stability, which is likely to be bad for humankind. So that's it for today. I hope you have a good understanding of exotic species and when they can become invasive and some of the problems with invasive species, as well as the connection between biodiversity, productivity, and stability, and how those can be altered by nutrient loading and also by the presence of invasive species. Until next time, study hard.